This video will cover the Berlin defense, which is e4, e5, knight to f3, knight c6, bishop to b5, and now knight to f6. Now, we will look at all of the major responses that white has, which includes castling, as well as several methods of defending this pawn on e4. We will also look at some traps and some things that you should be aware of, and we'll end the video with a puzzle that arises from the Berlin defense. So stay tuned for that. Like this video if you enjoy it, subscribe if you're new around here, and with that out of the way, let's begin. Definitely the most common response is castling. The idea here is after you take the pawn, which is what you should do, white is looking for some very quick and sharp tactical ideas to win a lot of material. Specifically, white has two ideas, rook to e1 and d4. If they play rook e1, you should know to drop your knight back and attack the bishop here. However, after they take the pawn with the knight, don't take the bishop in view of knight takes c6, which is absolutely crushing. And instead, what you should do is play the move bishop to e7, looking to castle. And although it might seem like you're the one that's being attacked, there's actually no threat for white here. And you also have some pressure on white's pieces. A lot of your pieces are out. There's no real attack to be careful of, and you can castle very quickly. So this is a perfectly fine position to land yourself in. Instead, however, white will often go for the move d4 here. The idea of d4 is if you take the pawn, rook e1 becomes that much stronger because the pin here is suddenly apparent, and there's not much you can do to defend against this knight. They're going to be able to, at some point, push their f3 pawn. They're going to be able to rack up more pressure on you, and this is a terrible position to be in as black, which is why, instead of taking the pawn, you drop the knight back again to d6. d6 is the ultimate square that your knight typically ends up on because it's a great central square that attacks white's bishop and still maintains the possibility of moving on to the king side, as you will see in a couple of moves. Now here, if they take the pawn, well, suddenly you take the bishop. They can go a4. They're going to win the knight back, but by doing so, they're going to ruin their pawn structure a little bit, and they're fighting for equality here. You're not. You can develop very quickly, very actively, and you have a perfectly fine position here. This isn't probably what white wants to do, which is why instead, in this position, white will most likely take your knight here, and after you take with the d-pawn, opening up this bishop, they will take here. Now you move your knight to f5, going to the king side, and we reach the very common endgame that arises from the Berlin defense. Now, there's a lot of argue who is doing better here. The truth is both people have chances, and this really comes down to how good you are in endgame. You have the two bishops here. However, white has more space. They have more active pieces. They can attack your king very easily as your king is in the center. So both people have chances, and it's really about how well you play in this endgame. So bishop to e7 can come. You can try to tuck your king away somewhere, develop your other pieces, get your rook centralized, and go from there. So this is a very common endgame you definitely should familiarize yourself with if you're going to play the Berlin defense. Now going back, this is kind of what happens if white castles, but there's also this pawn here you're attacking, and a very common approach is simply going d3 and defending it, and knight c3 leads to very similar positions where instead of castling quickly, both players are just developing their pieces, looking to actively put the pieces on the board. Now here you can continue with, for example, bishop c5, setting up a little trap, because if they take, d takes, knight takes, there's queen d4, fork on the checkmate and the knight, and typically there's this move knight d3 to defend, but that's not possible here, and knight g4 is also, of course, not possible, so this is a very deadly position, which is why they're obviously not going to take, and instead play a move perhaps like c3, trying to solidify the center, and at some point push for d4, but this shouldn't worry you. You can castle, they'll castle, you can play d6, looking to develop your bishop, and I mean, this is a very standard position. You have your pieces developed, you can go to look to pin this knight, And you have very typical ideas here that you would really against any sort of opening like the Italian or like the Roy Lopez, where you get this sort of pawn structure with pawns on d6, e5, you can castle, and your bishop typically develops to g4. So this is, again, another position that you should try to familiarize yourself with. And going back, if they try, a move like knight c3, well, that leads to very similar positions, just in a different move order. They won't be going for c3 and d4. Instead, they're probably just going to go for d3 alone, which is another approach. It gives this knight a better square than if the pawn was on c3. But you can develop normally, develop your bishop, castle, lock up, develop the other bishop somewhere, and you're doing perfectly fine. Now, the only other thing that you should note is that if bishop takes knight early on, this definitely shouldn't worry you because of queen d4. You're going to regain the pawn and actually have a very dominating queen in the center of the board. Here is a puzzle that arose from the Berlin defense. It is black to move, and there is a beautiful idea here. Take some time, try to solve it, and let's look at the solution. The move here is knight to b4. The idea with this move is that you have two threats. The obvious threat of this fork here, but a side threat that might not be so obvious is bishop takes h2, winning the queen, which is why any attempts to defend this pawn lose to bishop takes h2, and you take the queen. Similarly, if they were to trade the bishop, if they were to start by taking your bishop on e6, bishop takes h2, and again, you're winning the queen. So there's just an abundance of threats with this knight b4 idea here, the fork, and winning the queen. If they move their queen to safety, well, you can trade the bishops off first, but ultimately you end up with this fork winning quite a lot of material in this position. So a really beautiful puzzle. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Subscribe if you're new around here. Leave a like if you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.